All right, so we're going to hear from now our first cyber expert, Bob Braun, like I said, Jeffer Mangels Butler and Mitchell LLP, one of our sponsors. Bob's law practice has spanned more than 30 years, focuses on corporate and emerging technologies, cybersecurity, information technology, and electronic commerce matters for a wide range of middle market companies, including professional service firms, hotels, healthcare, and financial firms. Bob?
I've never shared a dais with politicians before, so this is a new experience for me. I'm hoping that I don't offend anyone here, or if they do, I guess that's the way it goes. Please feel free to ask questions during the time. Just try to catch my attention. We will have time for questions afterwards. But, frankly, the questions you have may be a lot more interesting than things that I have to say, so we ought to go for the things that people would like to say. What are we going to talk about over the next 45 minutes? Well, we're going to talk about what's new in data threats. What are we currently facing? We're going to talk about where your obligations and liabilities come from. As a business, as proprietors, as workers in businesses, where's liability created for you? We're going to talk about privacy policies and why privacy policies are both a protection for you and a threat to your business. We're talking about risk assessment, because risk assessment is the first step to determining whether you can create a secure and a stable system. And we're going to talk a very little bit about cyber insurance, because we're blessed today to have people who actually understand cyber insurance. I will tell you that my general practice, I have been practicing law for more than 30 years, and what I've learned over the years is I know less and less every day, and one of the things I know less about every day happens to be cyber insurance, so we have people from Bolton who are going to cover that. And then finally, responding to a data breach and how enjoyable responding to a data breach might be. So we have 6 large topics. We have 45 minutes. The likelihood of getting through all of these is very slim. But we do have the product. We do have the handouts. If you would like to get a copy of the deck, feel free to contact me. But we'll work through and see what we can get through. I don't think I've ever actually gotten through the entire deck. So if we do it today, well, we'll see what happens. So what is new in data threats? Well, the first thing is, I think you'll find out, I'm not talking at any time about I should be as people are recording this. I am not going to talk about credit card theft, because credit card theft is frankly passé. If you want, credit card theft happens all the time. I am sure that there is not any person here who has not gotten a letter advising them that their credit card data has been stolen, they're getting a new credit card, and I think when we get that letter, we no longer have the same sense of angst or unhappiness or fear. We look at it and say, gosh, I'm going to have to tell people that I have a new credit card number, and that's about as far as it goes. We know we're not losing any money out of it. It's just a low-level issue. And it's because basically that's a high-volume, low-margin business. If you want credit card numbers, you can go on the dark web and you can go to something that looks a lot like Amazon or any other store, and you can buy credit card numbers for anywhere from 1.5 cents to 25 cents a piece. You can get them with money-back guarantees. You get volume discounts, things like that. It's not a big deal. I'm focused on things that actually are going to be a problem for your business, and that's what we talk about at my firm. So first of all, denial of service. A denial of service is when your system, your website, or your system is attacked, and it's attacked by, it's a swarming attack. It is an idea that quantity has its own quality. So an example of one of these is there's a guy named Brian Krebs. He is probably the top writer, top blogger on data security. He used to be with the Washington Post. He found that they work too slowly. 2 or 3 days to get something approved is not fast enough in this area. So he started his own, and he's very well known for outing people who are cyber criminals. So they attacked him. They attacked him with thousands upon thousands of closed-circuit television cameras in China. Okay, so what does that have to do with it? Everything you got these days has a little computer in it. Almost everything is attached to the internet. Almost all of these things have very low security. Sometimes they don't have any security, other times we don't change them. So what happens? They get redirected to ping that website or to ping that computer and take it offline entirely. It takes off. Now, why do people do that? Well, one reason is, as in this case, it was a matter of, it was a criminal act. It was a matter of trying to destroy something or take it offline. My partners always remind me that we are in this to make money, so the question is, how do you monetize that? And, never forget where we come from. And the fact is that what happens is people threaten to take you offline. And if you don't pay it, they will take you offline. This isn't a permanent issue, but it's a costly issue. You can protect against it. You cannot protect against it entirely. Another thing, and this has come up a lot, ransomware and lockerware. They're basically the same thing, but what happens then is a piece of malware, which hopefully we'll get to the story of malware, gets inserted into your system after a series of different malwares getting put into your system, these little program or applets. They will encrypt your system, and you'll get a note saying that your system is locked down. You cannot get either to your system. Sometimes you can't get to your data. Sometimes you can't even open up your system. And you have to pay X number of bitcoins or something like that and deposit it within 72 hours. If you don't do it within 72 hours, then the price goes up. It's not really high priced, but it will go up. That is actually is a big issue. It's not nearly as big an issue as the next issue, which is wiperware. I think most of you have seen, because of all the papers, the hundreds of thousands of computers that were affected in the WannaCry and the Petra or not Petra, or whatever they called it back in Europe. It started in Ukraine, and the Petra started with it was an accounting firm, a small accounting firm in Ukraine. They were attacked. They passed on their virus to other people. It's just like having kids in daycare. Everyone gets sick. And they pretended to, they said, we'll give you back your data if you send us these bitcoins. They never intended to give back the data. They never had. They wiped the data. It's a pain. You've got hundreds of thousands of computers, and you just send out the encryption code to every one of these people. When we looked at that, we and others, and actually when I say we, I mean people who are smarter than me and more technical, looked at this and they said, no, it's impossible that they were actually attempting to recreate the software. They were just wiping the software and hoping to get some money out of it. And they did. Not a lot. It's estimated they got, I think, $143,000 is what they figured out. They know that because they followed the bitcoins. Bitcoins are not anonymous. You can figure out where they come from. But that's probably a bigger issue, the wiperware. And that's going to lead to, hopefully we'll talk about the big issue you have, which is not how to prevent someone from stealing or prevent someone, more importantly, from ruining your data, as it is to be able to recover from that. And then finally, this is something that was mentioned before, was impersonation. Impersonation happens when someone gets enough information about you that they are able to impersonate you and cause havoc. So I do hope, by the way, no one is actually live streaming this on Facebook, because that would be against, I don't do the Facebook thing. But if you know enough about something, let's say it's my partner, my managing partner, Bruce Jeffer, someone knows enough about them and they're technically adept. And again, technically adept means that they went on the dark web and spent $250 to $3,000 to get a kit to do this. You actually don't need to do anything. You don't need to know any of this. And our bookkeeper gets an email from Bruce Jeffer saying, send $50,000 to so-and-so. Here's the address. And it looks right. The address looks like it's Bruce Jeffer. He doesn't say please or thank you, so you think, yeah, that's probably Bruce Jeffer. We joke about that law. I mean, that is literally, that is the key. If there have been times that people have done that, and when it says, would you please do that, people say, no, he never says please. So it's something about law about lawyers. We're not into the please and thank you. And there were typos in it, which is just the way Bruce talks. So they sent it out. By the way, this never happened, and don't tell Bruce about this. And they come back to the office, and he's looking at the financials, and he calls in the bookkeeper and said, what's this $50,000? He said, well, you told me to send that out. And I said, I never told you that. I was out on vacation. That's because that's impersonation. That's because you find out enough about someone to impersonate them. And by the way, there's really no recourse for that. There's no legal recourse, because what happened is the bookkeeper who was authorized to initiate a wire contacted the bank using all the proper credentials. It was, in fact, the person who was authorized to send wires. And so and I would say, as much as I'm a believer in an active government, this is something you cannot legislate against. You can't legislate against stupidity. I mean, if you're most businesses, it requires how many people? You should not be able to authorize a wire with one person. There's a lot of simple things. In most places, sorry to go off on this, but it bothers me when clients tell me I need to do something. I say, think. Don't touch a hot stove, that kind of thing. So that usually it takes how many people to write a check? Probably 3 people. One person to request the check, one person to approve the check, and a third person to actually write and sign the check. Why wires don't require that, I don't know. So where do our obligations arise? Well, first of all, obligations arise from statutes and regulations. In California, we are required to maintain that if you have any personal information, you're required to take reasonable steps to maintain the security of that information. There are also other obligations. I'm getting ahead of myself. There are other obligations that are also chat about. Privacy statements. I mentioned that before. Will come up again. Privacy statements are required under the state of California. Since the state of California requires websites to have privacy statements, that means it's effectively a national law. We have lots of people, and we are, the fifth, Mr. Ridley Thomas mentioned, the 5th largest economy. People always end up in California, whether they like it or not, whether they're from Texas or not. And we say things in privacy statements which create obligations for us. By contract, I don't know how many of you people read your contracts. I actually read contracts. That's my job. And their contracts more and more often require reasonable security steps to be taken, sometimes unreasonable security steps to be taken. And then finally, there are industry requirements. If you take credit cards, you're required to follow the PCI, the payment card industry data security standards. Side note on that, I do a lot of representation of hotels, and I'm sure you've seen that a lot of hotels have been impacted by credit card theft. I'm mentioning it, I said I wouldn't, but I am. Every one of those hotels met the PCI DSS requirements, which gives you an idea of how effective those requirements are. I want to go very briefly through a couple of the key statutes and regulations. One of the key ones is HIPAA, the Health Care Portability, Health Information Portability and Protection Act, something like that. Who does it apply to? It applies to the obvious people, healthcare providers. It applies to doctors, hospitals, urgent care centers. It applies to a little less obvious people, business associates. What's a business associate? It's anybody who works with a healthcare provider. And every one of those people is supposed to have a contract with the healthcare provider, identifying what kind of information they have, how they're supposed to protect it, and so on. Little known fact about HIPAA, it's been around a long time. It did not start out, and it's not structured entirely as a data security issue, as electronic data. It came up because there was a truck which was carrying some healthcare data from one place to another, and a box fell off the truck. And they realized that was a problem, that people were just throwing these things on trucks, people weren't disposing, weren't keeping them properly. When I worked at a hospital in my youth, I worked in the records area. Anyone who wanted to could walk into that records area. Now it's easier to get into a nuclear facility than it is to a hotel, to a hospital records area. Financial services, this is another area. I got into data security 35 odd years ago because I worked in financial services. I was a bank regulatory attorney. And what happened then is that they were breaking down the barriers between commercial banking and investment banking. And that's why these days Wells Fargo is a bank. It doesn't just lend money and take deposits. It also is a wealth advisor. It also brings does investment banking and things like that. But at that time they realized that the sharing of data created an issue. So that's when it all started. So this goes back more than 30 years. But it's really under things like Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which is a statute that set up some more serious issues regarding regarding the treatment of data. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, like the HIPAA, applies to a lot of companies that you wouldn't think so. It there applies to people who work with financial institutions. They even tried to apply this to lawyers. We have a very good union, so we managed to stop that from happening. But it could happen, and so there are a lot of people, and you don't necessarily realize it, but it shows up in contracts and things like that. And I also mentioned that there are some more aggressive things. I mentioned the New York statute. There are a couple states that tend to be on the forefront of privacy and security. California is definitely one. We had the first data breach law, which was a boon for lawyers, if no one else. And New York has also been doing it. New York is a little bit more aggressive in obligating companies and firms to take affirmative steps to maintain the security of data. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong way. And then to mention another thing, there are a lot of specialty statutes. One of them is COPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It's been around for a long time, but basically, when you go and you put the fear that, well, I no longer have children, I have adults, so they're on their own. But for people who have children, you're always worried they're going to get online and they're going to give up data. So there actually is a law which prevents people from collecting data, knowingly collecting data about people under the age of 13. If people under the age of 13 are people, I think they're children, but collecting that data unless an adult supervises them. I've never quite understood how that gets absolutely enforced, but it's out there. And then finally, as I mentioned, in addition to New York, there are state-imposed statutes. As I said, California has one, Massachusetts have one, and these actually affirmatively require maintenance of security standards. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the Federal Trade Commission. I haven't heard a lot from the FTC, but during the Obama administration in particular, it attempted to set itself up as basically the de facto regulator, national regulator for security and privacy. And it did so under Section 5A of the Federal Trade Act, which allows them to regulate unfair and deceptive trade acts. Everything's related to everything. I think people say that. Well, it really goes back to the idea that we have privacy statements, and the privacy statements say we're going to maintain the security of your data, and therefore if someone breaches that, the FTC will say you breached what you represented to the public. Toward the end of the Obama administration, they started going further, and they became more aggressive about looking for people who hadn't necessarily violated their own privacy statement, but people who simply had breaches. And they looked at their systems and they said they weren't good. By the way, a great example is a hotel example, Wyndham Hotels, not to mention names, but Wyndham, who recently split off, I think yesterday or the day before, announced they were doing a split. They had said that they had a secure system. It wasn't. They were hacked multiple times. Even though they were hacked multiple times, they never really told anybody about it, and they never did anything about it. And the FTC decided enough was enough, and that's a classic case for the FTC. All right. So, breach notification laws. Let me actually hold off for a second. Does anybody have any, in case you forget the question, anybody have a question? Okay, so you're not awake. Excellent. You're mesmerized by I know. So California is on the forefront of breach notification laws. We were the first to decide that the way to regulate security and privacy is to require companies to tell their customers and their employees when their personal data had been breached. We're not alone. There are 48 states. Guam, the District of Columbia, that have laws. They're all a little different. When you have 48 states plus 2 territories that have different laws, and you have interstate commerce on this level, that really translates into a boondoggle for lawyers, because anytime there's a breach, you have to go to someone like me who will analyze the breach and decide how many different types of notices you have to give, who you have to give the notice to, and things like that. Unfortunately, there are some great state legislators here. There are no federal legislators here. If you want to create some kind of order in this chaos, we would get a federal breach notification law. If anyone wants to bet that that will happen in the next 4 years, I am taking the under. That's not going to happen. They just can't get it together. It's always up. There's a bill pending, at least one bill pending now, but it seems like obvious, but that's our government, our federal government these days. So what are the basic requirements in a breach notification law? What happens if you discover that someone has gotten into the personal information of your employees or of your customers or clients? Well, first of all, California, its basic requirement is that you have to notify, and this doesn't apply just to California businesses. Any business, and there's, by the way, a corresponding requirement for state agencies, requires a business or state agency to notify any California resident whose unencrypted personal information, as defined in the statute, was acquired or reasonably believed to have been acquired by an unauthorized person. I am a lawyer. I have the civil code site. So breaking this down is not quite as easy as it seems, because, first of all, there's a definition of what's personal information, which changes from time to time. It started out primarily as financial information. Personal information is being expanded, obviously, to health information. Eventually, my prediction, for what it's worth, is that we will talk, when we say personal information, we'll talk about what the European Union talks about in terms of personal information, which is anything that can identify an individual. Secondly, it's encrypted, has to be unencrypted. That makes it fairly easy to resolve unless you don't know what encryption is. And a lot of people, don't know what encryption is and don't know how to implement it. And there's a real argument about what encryption really works and what doesn't work. Because breaking encryption is just a matter of computer power. How much computer power can you apply to breaking the code? And then the biggest question is whether information was acquired or reasonably would have been acquired. There are all sorts of times where there's a breach in the system, and we determine that no notice is necessary because there's no indication of exfiltration of the data. Someone may have had the ability to get into the system, but did not actually retrieve information from the system. So this is why you have to talk to someone like me, like a lawyer. I mean, frankly, I hate to say it because, lawyers will tell you if you break your leg, you should first call a lawyer, then go to urgent care and things like that. But I will tell you that when you have a breach, you should first call your lawyer because the lawyer will help you if they know what they're doing, so you can call me, has to understand has to figure out what happened and has to protect you from lawsuits and things like that. And the best way we can do that is by making everything privileged information. So once we've decided there is a breach, just getting back on the subject, if there are more than 500 residents of California that are affected by a single breach notification, then you have to give that information to the Attorney General. This is relatively new. It's come up in the last several years. California was not the first one to do it, but almost every state has a varying different requirement. Some states require every breach to be reported to the state attorney general or another person. Under HIPAA, the healthcare law, every breach has to be reported to the Office of Civil Rights of the healthcare regulators. So, and there should be an obvious thing which clicks in your mind. That means that there is a governmental agency, and in this case, a law enforcement agency that is going to wonder about what you're doing and is going to keep track of you after that. The FTC keeps track of all of these, and they will also be after you potentially. Sorry. So I mentioned privacy policies. As I said, privacy policies are generally required under California, a lot of states, and therefore virtually everyone needs a privacy policy. So the privacy policy is also considered a best practice. You want to have something on a website. I bet that virtually everyone here has some kind of website, and even if all you do is you get the name of someone so you can respond to them, your website is going to require a privacy policy, and it can be a tremendous benefit to you because it'll describe what you're doing, what your obligations are, and it'll help limit your liability. The Federal Trade Commission, as I mentioned, is heavily into this because every time they see a breach, the first thing they do is they look at your website and decide if the breach represents an unfair trade or business practice. And it typically happens because when you write that privacy policy, you're very excited about your website. And some person who put that website together told you, you're never going to have a problem with this website. No one can possibly we have state-of-the-art stuff. So what are things that the FTC is looking for after there's been a breach of that particular website? They're saying statements like, we use state-of-the-art technology to protect your data. Your data is safe with us. That sounds good. And we never share data with anyone else. All those things are things that I immediately cross out when someone comes up to me with their privacy policy. What you want to do is we make attempts to do this, but we can't prevent anything. And by the way, the reason is because you cannot protect against the behavior of the person who is using your website. The person who's going to create the breach is not necessarily the company. It's going to be the people who use the company's website who get into the company's system. And that brings me into something where I'm going to take a little bit of an issue with the prior speakers. The issue in cybersecurity is not necessarily a technological issue. You cannot achieve a cybersecure environment simply by having good technology. You can avoid having it with bad technology, but you cannot ensure it with good technology. You also cannot legislate this. Legislation, like contracts, they're not self-affecting. They simply create consequences for failure to follow the legislation or failure to follow the contract. The only way that you can achieve a level of cybersecurity, and even then you can't achieve complete cybersecurity, is by considering the human factor. The fact that humans are involved in this process. If you could get rid of humans, then we could have cybersecure environments. Human error is relevant to virtually every breach and every security incident. I was interviewed about the HBO breach, and by the way, this morning, HBO got breached again, and if you want, they released another game. But I don't watch Game of Thrones, but they released another game. I know that gives me no credibility now. You're not but it's there. And someone asked me what happened. I said, I don't know what happened, but I will tell you that it was based on someone's credentials. Someone got into the system because they took advantage of a human being. So IBM, I quote IBM. My son is a consultant for IBM, so I have to quote IBM. In their 2016 report which is for the year ending 2016, they said 60% of all attacks were carried out by either malicious individuals, insiders, or inadvertent actors. That is probably a gross understatement. It's probably, we believe it's more like 100%. In their 2015 report, they said over 80%. I asked somebody who worked on the report, why it's down to 60%. Are we doing a better job? And he said, no, we just count differently now. And said, that's IBM. They make the rules. Well, what we're dividing is I look at an insider as someone who intentionally works on it. An inadvertent actor is someone who makes a mistake. And that leads right into that. The things that happen are negligence and mistakes. We send emails to the wrong person. I have to deal with every breach at my firm. I train people on deal with every breach. I sent out a notice saying, please do not lose your laptop. If you use your laptop, we have a breach report. But it's something like that. We send emails out to the wrong people. That technically can be a breach. There's external theft. We have to worry about people, and that's particularly things like employees, current and former employees. Tremendous number of breaches are related to listen, when you fire someone, you immediately have a disgruntled former employee who knows about your system. You may not have gotten you may not have segregated them from the system. Even if you have, they know how you work, and they can use that information to get into the system. And then, as was mentioned earlier, there's phishing, spear phishing, and whaling. I have no idea whether we'll get to that, but it's in there. But those are the fun things. Let me mention social engineering. I complained about Facebook a little while ago. This, again, is very much the human factor. Hackers will use social media to facilitate their phishing expeditions. I've heard of phishing. That's an attempt to get data, to work on your individual and your clients and your employees' human vulnerabilities. And they'll try to develop information so they can go through the process of attacking these people. There's very, very high value information on social media. We have birthdays, family names, workplace and work history, education, friends and interests, professional colleagues, memberships, things like that. If I do some fundraising, and I look at those lists, I say, if I know enough about someone, I don't have to know them. I can appeal to them. I can figure out don't always work, but I can try to get them to believe in my cause. When you have things like all this data on people, you can figure out their passwords, you can figure out what their user ID numbers are. I mean, how many people use their birthdays or combination of birthdays, family names, things like that? When someone knows where you work, they can impersonate you. When they know where you went on vacation, when they know you're on vacation right now, there are all sorts of things that people give up on Facebook and other social media that is tremendously valuable to the bad guys. And as I said, they use it for, these are some examples that don't really like, but are used. You call systems administrator, and you know all the right words. You know who's who, and tell them, hey, I need access. I'm locked out. I need access to my computer. They spoofing emails. I mentioned that before. My Bruce Jeffer example. Don't mention his name. Spoofing emails to subordinates to get them to pay money or to do things. Facilitating a spear phishing expedition to go after specific people to attack a company, things like that. So this is a little hard to say, but this is how spear phishing works. I'm sorry, I did want to get through to this. It starts with a hacker deciding they want to find, at number one, trying to decide that they want to find somebody. They want to get into a company. Maybe your company, maybe another company. They may want to get to you so they can get to one of your clients. You may be a small company dealing with very large companies. They follow people. They follow you. They follow someone else to find out as much as they can about you. They then create an email, which is a fake email, but it looks like from someone you know because it mentions restaurants you go to, or it mentions your vacation, or it mentions your children or your upcoming birthday or things like that. You write on Facebook, again, I shouldn't hit Facebook, but you write on social media, and they know how you write. They know your style, and they copy it. So they send that email to that employee. It goes through the spam filter because it meets all the requirements. It doesn't have the wrong subject line. It's from somebody who's recognized. And then you look at it and you say, hey, that's from John. I know John. I trust John. You open up the email, and either opening up the email or clicking, it says, I want to show you a picture. I went to so-and-so, and I thought you'd be interested. And they show a picture. You open that picture, and you have deposited malware into your computer. What that does, the malware gets on your computer. It calls home. It says, hi, I'm here. And it basically takes over your browser. You don't know because your browser can do two things at once. and it starts a process of depositing more and more software until it can put ransomware on your system, until it can encrypt your system, until it can wipe it out, or simply steal all your data. So those are the kind of things. That is why spear phishing works. That's why it's important to protect your personal information, even if you don't think you may not think it's a secret, but the more available it is, the more of a target you are. I wanted to show a couple things, show what happens, with this. This is a lawyer thing. I mentioned this because if you glance through it, there's a hacker who sent out to lawyers and said, hey, we're from the state bar, click on this because someone has filed a complaint against you. There's very few things which will get a lawyer clicking on that faster than knowing that they're being sued. I gotta know, all our brains go out the room, down the corner, and things like that when we see that. So what is it doing? It's looking for someone who's basically in a public database, but it's also posing as someone they should trust, the state bar, and it's hitting an emotional trigger. This is one of my favorite. People get stuff from DocuSign all the time. DocuSign, that's fine, but when you click on this, it's going to deposit malware. What's the most important line here? Well, there are two things. Well, the most important one is on the subject line, paid invoices. That will get someone's heart beating in a second. Somebody's going to pay me money. I'm going to find out what that is. None of us can afford, big firm, small firm, none of us are going to walk away from that. IRS also gets us going. My mother calls me because she gets calls from the IRS, and I have to explain to her, A, the IRS doesn't call anybody. The IRS will barely answer our calls when we have legitimate issues. They work by mail, or they actually show up and they sue you. They do not use email. The key in this one, and it's in the materials, I think, so you shouldn't have to try to read this tiny type, but it says, we owe you money. So it's hitting fear from the IRS and greed, and people are going to click on that. That's it. And then it's nice little things start here. I think I only have a couple more minutes, and I do want to give room for questions. But the key issue when you are trying to figure out what your risk is to figure out, to addressing your risk is to figure out what your risk is. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution. There are components, but everything has to be made to order. There's no law or regulation that says exactly what you do. They all say you have to take reasonable steps under the circumstances to protect the information. There are some recognized compliance programs like PCI, like the data security for credit cards. But as I said, there's been no big breach of a company that was not in compliance with that. So that in itself, as I say, there's a difference between compliance and security. Compliance is fine. It will limit some of your liability, but it will not eliminate it. And and as I said, each of these emphasize not that this is what you do and you're secure, but you have to figure it out yourself. So the elements of risk assessment: what information do we collect? What personal information do we collect? Names, addresses, credit card numbers, things like that. How do we hold the information? Do we encrypt it? Do we keep it in a safe environment? What do we do with the information? People collect information the way my mother-in-law collects everything. We're rat packs when it comes to information, or pack rats. Sorry, rat pack's something different. That's right. So we're pack rats. So there's all sorts of information, and the more information you collect, the more liability that you have. So think about what information you collect. What do you really need to do your business? Who has access to the information? Law firms are terrible this way, by the way, because law firms make all of our data available to almost everyone. I can get to just about everything, which makes it a difficult system to secure. And what are our legal or regulatory requirements? And I should say contractual requirements. Are we in healthcare? Do we deal with children? Are we in a banking industry? Is there something about our industry? Are we dealing with the government? All those things have different requirements. And as I said, contractual obligations. Look at your agreements more and more. You'd be surprised at what your obligations are. And by the way, these go two ways. You're going to sign up for cloud systems because that's what everyone does. It's probably what everyone should do. Who is responsible for a problem? The cloud company's trying to push it on you. We're trying to push it on them. And ultimately, what are the risks that we face? And the level of risk we're willing to assume. Because it's all about the risk. And they're basically, it's about risk identifying, management, and mitigation. And there are 4 critical questions. What risks are you willing to accept? What risks do you have to accept in order to do business? What risks are you unwilling to accept on any basis? What things can you say, I don't care, if I have to go out of business, I will not accept a certain risk? What risk can you shift to a third party? What can you shift to a service provider, a cloud provider, a contractual party? And as I'll get to soon, my favorite, what risk can you shift to insurance? Which is itself a sort of an interesting question. I am going to skip cyber insurance because there's more people than me on it. Should be happy when this happens in any presentation. Well, that's a lot of stuff. I guess I didn't think about that. And then find the data response plans. Basically, you got to have a plan. You can't wait to develop a plan for when you actually do have the risk. The longer it takes to resolve it, the more costly it is, the more damage that's done. Average breach in 2016 was $221 per record. A small business may have 10,000 records, really small business. That is $2,210,000 worth of damage. And the cost of, so there's a very simple, there's a cost-benefit analysis to having a system in place. It makes sense on a number basis. You can't get cyber insurance without it, things like that. What you need to do is establish a team. It's not your IT people. It's people who deal with security. IT and security are 2 different things. IT lets people into your system. Security keeps people out of your system. They're very different. And it should not necessarily be someone who is in your shop. It should be a third party so that they can criticize what you've done without losing their jobs. You have to involve the top level of management. If top level management is not involved, it's not an effective system. Your information technology people, human resources, because many of these involve the employees, public relations. How are you going to present this? I can write a breach notification letter. I've done dozens and dozens of them. But the best ones go to a PR person who reminds me that I shouldn't say certain things. And, of course, legal, although I would put legal at the top. And then finally, your operations people. You're going to have to consider potentially changes to your operations when you have a data breach. I will mention that you have to have roles, that you should test this. You actually have to go out. I do tabletop tests or actual tests so you can see what happens. Will people react? Do you have the right phone numbers to call people? Things like that. And this is all stuff that I think you don't have to worry about. The response to data, these are pretty obvious things. What happens if you don't have a plan in place? You have to create a plan then and there. That's a lot of fun. I will tell you, though, that's not on the deck, that because we're working through this idea, I think the most important thing in all of this is not to have a plan you need a plan to respond to a data breach, really by law. You need to protect data also by law and contract. But probably for your businesses, the single most important thing is to have a backup that works and test the backup. The question that you should be able to ask and answer, or you have to ask and should be able to answer is, if someone steals my data, if someone blocks me out of my data the way they did with the ransomware and the wiperware, how long will it be before I can send out a bill? How long will it be before I can get back in business? From last month, the people on the WannaCry base, there are still people who have not recovered, and they'll go out of business. And as was mentioned earlier, smaller businesses don't have as much room to work. So you have to have a backup that works. You have to test that backup. If you do nothing else, have a secure, good backup that you can test. We always like to end with this because passwords are fun. I like to mention that passwords are like underwear. You don't let people see it. You should change it often. And you should never share it with strangers. Anyway, so that's it. So I have time for questions. I think a minute or two if anybody has any questions. If anyone's away. Tom?
Great amount of information. As a small business owner, I'm not that concerned about ransomware because virtually everything is cloud-based now. But where is the breach? I think you mentioned something about, well, that pushes it on the cloud provider. Is Salesforce the guilty party, and I don't have to worry at all? Or?
No, you don't. You have to, you know, God forbid, well, you have to worry. Worry is the basis of our lives, worry and guilt. You have to allocate the risk. I mean, there are two issues. One of them is that what Salesforce will do is they'll push it down and say, it was your fault that there was a breach because you did not protect your passwords, you didn't change them often and things like that. But you have to look at something like Salesforce or any cloud provider, and you have to make them prove that they have a system that will get you back in shape. I mean, if you're relying on a cloud system, and nothing's completely cloud. What you really have to figure out, and we have been pounding our IT people ever since we saw the WannaCry and the NotPetya, is to say, imagine we were completely wiped out and we had to build from the beginning. How could we do that? That's not that easy. You know, what are our workarounds? And also, how do we know that we're not perpetuating the virus? Because I mentioned one of the problems is that malware is resident in computers for a long, long time. People don't, when it gets deposited, it phones home, but no one necessarily answers on the first ring. So you have to be able, there are backup systems which will clean the system, which will make sure that it's a clean system, but you have to make sure that you have it, and if you're relying on another provider, you have to make sure that they have that as well. Yes?
What are the financial institutions doing to investigate the source? For example, I've received a lot of phishing emails, and I write report phishing at wellsfargo.com. It's mostly Wells Fargo. So I just want to know, once you report it, what are they actually doing to get the source?
Yeah, so basically they're putting it into an international database. Most of the stuff originates in places that are very difficult to prosecute. It's difficult to go to Ukraine. It's difficult to go to these places, and you have places which turn a blind eye to it. And a lot of times it's state sponsored, or not say a lot of times they're state sponsored. But every time you report those, the banks and financial institutions report it to their regulators. And it's a matter of collecting all this data, collecting information, and they find out and they put pieces together. And periodically, over the last month, there have been several syndicates that have been taken down. The problem is it's like whack-a-mole. They keep coming back up. But when you report it, it's just like if you ever have a breach, you should report it to the local FBI and local police. Santa Monica has a dedicated department. The FBI here in Los Angeles has a dedicated department. LA is very big in cyber, so you report it. Someone mentioned to me, and I think maybe writing an article on it, on sort of the hive complex. It's like virus protection, that the more people who do this, the more people who act rationally and try to protect their information, the greater protection we all have. Getting the inoculations works when 95% of the people have it, because something is going to happen. It's the same thing here. I don't know what the percentages are, but there's a concept that the more people protect their data and report problems and things like that, the greater security the entire system has. Sure. Okay. Well, thanks very much. Appreciate the time.